I have some handouts. What I was going to do is take just a few moments to give you some very high-level basics about the way the city budget is built, essentially where the money comes from and where the money goes, and then talk a little bit about the process that's used to build the city budget, and then quickly, and ideally I think, turn to questions from you all. As those come around, just a little bit about me, not that you need to know too much, but relevant to this conversation, I've worked for the city for 19 years. 12 and a half of them I was working for the city council. They have a staff of folks who work for all 9 council members. I worked in that group. I eventually managed that group. And I worked the council side of the budget process for many years, which apparently made me qualified to work the mayor's side of the budget process, because I've done that now for going on 6 years. That's where I'm coming from, and so I have a certain amount of history, if nothing else. Real quick, the slides I have here are actually with respect to the 2019 budget, so this year's budget. We just announced, the mayor just proposed the 2020 budget. For the purposes at this level, not that much has changed. So I didn't take the time, I didn't have the time to redo the slides, but again, it hasn't really changed. So the overall city budget here is about $6 billion. It's a little bit larger now, almost 6.5. So that includes everything, and I think sometimes people don't know, and I suspect you all do because you're more connected, but the Seattle City Light and Seattle Public Utilities, the water utility, the drainage utility, the solid waste utility, those are all part of city government. So when we look at the big pie here, that's all included. So for instance, in that big pot of utilities and transportation, those 2 utilities are each now over $1 billion, and the transportation department has gotten pretty large. Its budget's in the neighborhood of $300 or $400 million. A big chunk of that, the Move Seattle levy, which again I suspect many of you know a good deal about. That's bringing in about $100 million a year. We'll talk a little bit more about property taxes, of which that's an example of that levy. You can see public safety is a big piece, as is the ones that are labeled here: neighborhood, human services, arts and culture. Administration, I probably would do myself a favor to break that out a little bit more so you don't think we're quite as top-heavy as that would make it appear. There are a number of internal services that includes, things like our IT department and our HR department as examples. But there are other pieces there too, so some of our internal, smaller offices and the like. But that just gives you kind of a big picture. The next slide is a piece of that overall spending. So this is talking about the general fund, and it's $1.3 billion of that roughly $6 billion. And right now, in the new budget, it's closer to 1.4.5-ish. And so this is made up of, and we'll talk about the revenue sources for the general fund in just a second. This is really the most flexible monies that the city has in terms of its uses. For example, the utility money, right, so there's $1 billion plus that's collected from utility rates and from the sale of power. We generate more power than we need here in the city. That money can only be used to pay for things electrical, if you will. Similarly, the money you pay for your water bill can only be used for things water. With one caveat: we tax in a sales tax kind of way both Seattle Public Utilities and City Light. So the tax part of your bill comes to the city, but the rates, the part that's paying for the water itself, that can only get used for water.
And is that principle set in
state constitution?
In the state constitution?
Yeah.
I'll come back to that. Thank you.
So one of the more interesting recent events, and I had these kinds of tales I could wind forever, and I will try not to bore you, but a few years back, the city had for a long time been using electric utility rates to pay for streetlights, and it was ruled that that's not okay, because streetlights are a general government function, like rather than something that utilities should do itself. So now, in a kind of maybe strange way, your general tax dollars, so some of this money, pays for streetlights. So that's just an example of that distinction. What you see among, and I'll talk again about where this money comes from, but what you see about here is that the biggest chunk of that very flexible money is going to public safety. In principle, fire and police. So the police budget is north of $400 million. The fire budget is north of $200 million. Actually closer to $3. So you can see that, and then the courts and the law department are a very small part of this purple.
What are the activities that are included in public safety?
It's the police and fire are the principal ones. So we have more than 1,000 officers and more than 1,000 firefighters. The way the firefighting, the way the fire department works is they essentially have a fixed staffing model. Every fire station is staffed the same way 24/7. So we have some pretty good response times as a result. That's an expensive endeavor. That's a lot of people and their equipment as well. The police department, again, we'll talk a little bit perhaps about it. We have a good many officers. We've been trying to hire more of late. That's a challenge. It turns out to be a challenge nationwide. But it gives you a sense that although there's a lot of money here, a lot of it is dedicated to some very basic function.
What happens when you do work for the homeless, for different police community activities? Is there a account that human resources pays for, or homeless funds paid for?
So,
or is those funds donated basically to as far as police responsibility?
No, the extent that the police department is involved in various ways in our response to homelessness. A very obvious example is the navigation team that we actually do navigation teams now. So those are folks who are doing outreach to homeless folks who are experiencing homelessness, and part of that is to have security both for the folks who are there and then also to provide security for the folks who are homeless themselves. The police part of that enterprise is in this purple, right? But at the same time, there are social workers and others involved, and they're in the red part here. They're in the human services piece of this. So it's not so easy to slice it that way.
So do you have a way of identifying how much is spent on homeless activities? All the different departments?
We do, and we have. So the overall city's response to homelessness is in the neighborhood of $100 million a year. That again includes police department. That includes expenditures on shelters. It includes some amount of support for tiny home villages. There's a variety. It includes ever more work on preventing homelessness. So intervening with folks who are at the edge of losing their home and making an effort to. Often it's a small bit of financial assistance or steering them towards some particular bit of assistance, job placement or something else that avoids them falling into homelessness, which the data show is best for everybody. Obviously best for them, but also from a perspective of cost and the like, better for all of us as well.
Where do those funds come from?
Most of those comes from this same pot, this general fund, but there are also federal and state pass-through dollars, so there's funding from the federal government for some of those services.
So $100 million is not coming out of this item?
Not all of it, no. But a significant share, to be clear.
Do you know how much roughly it is spent out of this pot?
It's a good question, and as I sit here, I don't want to give you bad data, so bad information.
But what you're getting at is like the police department isn't going to bill another department because they were dealing with homeless issues or
Exactly.
whatever else.
Yeah, we don't.
I wonder how much federal.
Go ahead.
I just wonder how much federal dollars we get.
Yeah, we get community development. We get block grant dollars from the federal government, and we can use a certain share of those dollars for services, and among those services are things like shelters. So, as an example, and we've done ever more work in focusing our investment in shelters into shelters that are providing better services. So often 24/7 kind of arrangements, and then also working, and we are developing performance metrics. So the shelters that we are spending money on, we're keeping track of how many folks they are placing into long-term housing, because that's our goal and their goal as well. Flip it over, where does the money come from? So this is that same chart, in the sense that it's the same 1.3 billion. This actually shows you where the money is coming from. So these are the key components of that revenue, of that overall general fund. And what you can see in broad strokes is that there are about 5 roughly even pieces. The percentages are shown there. But sales tax is a big share of our flexible dollars. So we get of that 10% sales tax, the city gets about 1%. So 1/10, just to be clear. That flows into the general fund. There's also a small amount of the sales tax, 0.1, for instance, that goes to the Seattle Transportation Benefit District, which is our voter-approved revenue stream. So that's actually not included here. This is the general fund sales tax. But just to give you a sense of that, property tax This is the part of your property tax that is going to the general government, again, to support all the things on the previous page. This piece does not include the voter-approved levies, because the voter-approved levies are not flexible dollars in the same way as the general fund. They can only be spent on the things for which you voted for. At this stage, the property tax revenues from the voter-approved levies are almost as large as this piece here. And we can talk perhaps a little bit more. That's in no small part a result of Hyman initiative from almost 20 years ago now that changed the way the city can increase property taxes year to year. The next big piece is, and there's some acronym here, is B&O tax. That's business and occupation tax. That's our tax. That's our business tax. It is a tax that's applied to the gross revenues of businesses. So not their profits, but their overall revenues. I'm an economist by training. I could give you a long lecture about why profits tax would probably be a better idea. We don't have that authority. Our taxing authority comes from the state, and the structure of our B&O taxes is largely determined by the state. We do, again, if you want to geek out about this stuff, we do apply a different tax rate to retail businesses and to manufacturing businesses, a lower rate, because we recognize that in order to generate their revenues, they have to buy a lot of inputs, so they have essentially on average, a lower profit margin than perhaps another kind of service industry. The purple piece is the utility taxes, which I mentioned before that we have taxes on our public utilities, both SPU and City Light. We also apply utility taxes to the private utilities. So we have natural gas, we have some on telecom as well. We can tax telephone activity. We can't tax data, so we're not taxing the internet. That's another strange or interesting fact. The tax from telephone has been declining over time because nobody's talking anymore. And they're pulling their landlines. We get taxed off I got two of them, one of them's for work. We get taxed when you talk on that, and data, but not when you're surfing the internet. So we get, so.
God, imagine how much.
Yeah, so again, I don't want to sound greedy. And then I have sort of a broad category here of other. There are ranges of taxes and fees on other things that kind of make up the rest. But that gives you a sense of where the money comes from, again, to that flexible pot. And then flipping over, talk a little bit about the budget development process. The way this is perhaps skewed, I'm going to talk more about the executive process. Although, as I described, I worked on the council side for more than a decade and know that well, but obviously Councilmember here can also explain some of that. But just to give you a sense, I'm always working on the budget. So as soon as we're done, as soon as the council votes in November, we get a little bit, it slows down a little bit in December, but then we gear right back up in January. So we do, every other year, we do a biennial budget. We're in the second year of the biennial budget, so the mayor has just proposed the 2020 budget, a single year budget. And the way in the other year, when we do the 2 years, the way that works is the first year, so in this case, the 2019 budget, was adopted as a legal matter, and it includes the legal appropriations. It allows the departments to spend money. The second year is endorsed, so it essentially is a planning basis. And it's one, and consistent with this description, we use it at the budget office as the basis for the next year. So when I engage the departments across the city at the beginning of the year, and we did that this year, and we said, okay, your 2020 budget is the base. That's why we did this. That's why we planned ahead. We will move off that base if there are reasons to do that. Reasons, what those reasons might be. We have a little more revenue, and I'll talk about revenue forecast here in a second. That might be a reason why we'd be soliciting ideas for ways we might invest additional resource. We might have less revenue. So when we built the budget for 2020, that was now more than a year ago, we were guessing at what the revenues would be for 2020, and if we had guessed high, that plan is a plan that would spend more money than we have. So we could, and I've been through those cycles as well. It's been a little while. I'm just as happy that it has. Yeah, thank you. But another thing is that priorities could have shifted. I mean, and that could happen because a new council or a new mayor, council members or mayor has come into office, and they're like, you know what, that was an endorsed budget, but I'm thinking about things differently. Or because things have changed, within the community. There is, across the city, there's a change in priorities from the year previous. So it's not that we're locked in, but it does provide a strong basis from which to start the conversation, if you will. The first thing we do is we make sure we establish a clean baseline budget. So we look at the previous. So as I start this process next year, we'll be planning for a biennial budget for 21 and 22. And when we do the baseline budget, we take a look at what the departments were spending in 2020 then, and we say, okay, if you wanted to do all the same stuff you did this year, if that was the base, what would it cost to do that? And in doing that process, we take a look at what are the drivers that are increasing costs. So maybe we have wage contracts that call for increases in salaries. We have to make sure we keep track of that. On the flip side, maybe we put some money in the budget in the previous year that was designed to buy a computer system. And having bought that computer system, we don't need that money in the budget for the next year. So we clean it up, if you will, in that way. And then once we figure out what that baseline is, and we have an idea what our previous revenue forecast is, we see how those two things line up, right? So we're like, okay, so if the baseline budget is above, would spend more than our revenues, then we need, the first conversation we have with the departments is to say, hey, we're going to have to figure out how to reduce some of your baseline spending. That's not going to work. And typically we say, here's your target and bring us some ideas. The reverse could be true though. We do the baseline, we see we have a little bit more money. The revenue forecast then is a key part of this process because we are balancing the budget to our forecast of how much money we're going to take in. And if you flip back, and I'm not suggesting you should, a lot of the major revenue sources, particularly to the general fund, are entirely dependent on the local economy and how well it is doing. So we develop a forecast for the local economy in terms of the number of jobs we expect to see growing, average income we think is going to be, and from that we translate that into a forecast of the revenue for the city. We do that in a really in-depth way twice a year, once in the spring, essentially we do it in the April-May time frame, and then we do it again late in the summer. So we do it in the spring so that we could work over the course of most of the year planning towards the right numbers, and then we do it again in August so that when we actually submit the budget, we are as tight as we can to whatever the forecast is. And then we do a quick update at the beginning of November while Council, we'll get to the bottom here, Council is then working in the budget from end of September through November. And the data that we've used to develop our forecast at that point is pretty old. It's from July, so it's several months old. And so we want to make sure things haven't changed materially. And sometimes they have. The Great Recession and the financial markets froze in September, if you think way back. And so we had a proposed budget from the mayor that was no longer going to work even by the time the council had picked it up. I was working with the council at that time, so that was an example of a challenging year. So we provide, based on that revenue forecast, we provide direction from the departments, give us some ideas, they bring them back. We take those to the mayor and say, hey, these are some of the ideas. We also do things where we say, hey, the mayor was thinking about this, and we ask the departments, the mayor wants to do this, show us how you would do it, bring us back that idea. We then take that all essentially in a first round to the mayor and say, hey, this is what we've got. We make recommendations about how to narrow it down so that we can focus on what matters and get feedback from her, in this case, about what she cares about. And then we do another round with the departments where we say, okay, we find these proposals. These are the ones that are worth working on. We get them back from the departments in June, July. We then do some more work with the departments, getting to understand them better, bring them to the mayor at the end of July, August. We then have a new revenue forecast, and we line things up and deliver the proposed budget to the city council traditionally at the end of September. Traditionally, actually, the last Monday, but not this year because of high holy days. So the mayor delivered the budget this past Monday. And then council picks up the budget, and over the course of essentially 2 months, works through first. There's a set of presentations from the department so the council can get a sense of what's in each department's budget and ask questions of them. Those are actually scheduled for later this week, starting tomorrow no less, and into next week. And then council really takes over the process, and council staff brings forward ideas and recommendations, having obviously consulted with council members. And then the council has to produce whatever it does to the budget. The mayor has to produce a balanced budget. So we unlike the federal government, we're not running operational debt. We do issue bonds so we can do capital stuff, but we're not, as a overall matter, issuing debt to cover operations. So we have a balanced budget, and the council will make changes to the budget, but that too has to be balanced. And traditionally, the council adopts its changes, its budget by Thanksgiving. And we need it done by the end of November so that it can be legally in effect by January 1 of the following year. So that's at a high level process and the like. And I am open for questions.
Can I go back to my question?
Sure.
And we just found out from, HPAC and through the blog that we did get funding for this, and I'm going to call it the roundabout, even though they had said it was, originally when I moved here 4 years ago, it was about 3.5. I think that's what we got from the mayor. But about a month and a half ago, SDOT came and said, oh, no, it's 7 or more. And so my question is, if we don't, the city, SDOT comes in, they decide something, the mayor gives us 3.5, we certainly don't want to get rid of that money, we've been asking for it forever. But we want what's done well, and if it takes more, so will they go ahead and hold that for us, or do they do part of it? How does that work, and how do we know that it will get done to the degree that pleases everybody?
So I'm going to get out on a limb a little bit because I think I know this, and you'll help me if I get this wrong.
If you would like me to, I will do my best. This
Yeah.
is your time, but I'm
No,
happy to pitch in.
What I think, the challenge for me is that I'm about this deep and about, like, I can't stretch my
So
arms.
many details.
Yeah, right. So my understanding is that the roundabout is not the funded solution that's in the budget. And that is not just a financial issue, but a design one. That the circle, if you will, doesn't fit within the intersection in a way that would allow trucks to move through it safely. So so that was a driving force. So what's funded, as I understand in the budget, is the resources to implement a full solution that, again, is not the roundabout. And to the extent that is a concern for you or not, I mean, that is, when we make those decisions, the mayor makes those decisions largely on SDOT's recommendations. SDOT is balancing the engineering issues, it's balancing the resources between this project and various others, and making decisions about reasonable and cost effective. Again, I think in this case it was actually an engineering concern about why the roundabout ultimately didn't work. But that money, for a project like that, it's potential that money is being allocated over a couple of years, because I don't know what the construction window would be. But again, my understanding is that the proposed solution is fully funded in the budget. It's not unusual for capital projects to sometimes end up running a little bit over their initial estimates. That's a whole other conversation. But committed to a project, we almost invariably follow through, and if there's necessary, it's usually not huge amounts of additional money. So I think it's a high level of confidence that that money is there to build the solution that there is. Now, if there's good policy discussion to be had about whether that's the right solution or not, your council member is well positioned to raise that issue and ask those questions.
So we, prior to the second quarter supplemental, which is a whole other budget process that we don't need to get into here, but we make an adjustment at several times throughout the year. This last mid-year adjustment, we actually went back and made sure that the funds that had yet to be committed to this project were reflected in what's called the CIP. That's the Capital Improvement Program. It's a 6-year planning document for all of the things that the city is building. Last budget cycle, there wasn't even a CIP page for that project. And so we amended the budget to include a CIP page. We earmarked the $300,000, and then mid-quarter supplemental, we bumped that up to $500,000 of identified money, and then we put in another $3 million of TBD money, and the mayor added some extra money in her proposed budget, but turned what we had identified as TBD, meaning the revenue had not yet been identified for our aspirational 3 million, and found some money, not just for that 3 million, but for the extra that the mayor had kicked in. So, but nevertheless, it is in a planning document that is a 6-year planning document. It is, the CIP description is written in a way that I think is flexible, both to do a solution that is not a roundabout, as well as continuing to explore the roundabout. I've asked SDOT to go back and look at whether or not there is a way to redesign the roundabout to bring those costs down. We still have folks in the state legislature that are interested in helping us get matching funds as well for a more complete solution. And I think those are conversations that we have to continue to have. I have not yet heard back from SDOT about the redesign that we've asked for and what that would cost, but you can be certain that I'm going to be continuing to ask that. It was actually the redesign concept was something that a District 1 resident who's a traffic engineer came up with. So I think it's worth a fair look before completely putting aside that option for some of the other fixes that SDOT is recommending might be easier and less costly.
Well, and I don't want to take up too much time, but it is one of just 3 entrances onto the peninsula. So it really affects more than just Highland Park. But, and you know I'm a relatively new resident anyway, but I thought SDOT was the person who was the department that really was asking for the roundabout, who had said that was what we needed.
You're
So
absolutely correct.
am I right about that?
SDOT had worked with the community to come up with this design that now they say is nearly
Can't do
twice. I have not heard that they can't do it. And I might be wrong about that. I need to refresh the history around that project, but my recollection is not that they can't do it, but that they understand that there's a great urgency in the community, both for moving the traffic that comes from all over the peninsula to go down the hill and get onto either the First Avenue Bridge or the other way over to the West Seattle Bridge, as well as, it would serve a dual purpose. It will move traffic more smoothly through an area that gets very congested during rush hour, and then when it's not rush hour, it's dangerous, and there have been countless accidents in that area. So the question is whether or not the proposed solution also has those dual purposes, and you're absolutely right. This is a solution that SDOT had originally identified as the best solution.
What are the assessments that you place on contractors to make money available for the MHAs located in the budget?
So the resources generated by the MHA, mandatory housing affordability, are allocated to the Office of Housing. So they also don't. Yeah, so they're not in that pie either. It's a separate dedicated revenue stream into the Office of Housing. I'm not going to be able to quote you off the top of my head what the expectation is for next year, but what we expect is that they'll start to ramp up because the MHA payments are made as the projects reach critical stages, and the law is recent enough that some of the larger projects haven't come up out of the ground and been through permitting yet.
Where can the public see how much has been assessed and how much has been collected?
If you look at the budget is online, so Seattle.gov, and you go to the department, you pick budget, you can pull up the Office of Housing. They'll have a chapter, if you will, and you can click your way through. And there will be a revenue page associated with the Office of Housing, and it will show you the revenues that are flowing into the Office of Housing, and one of them will be MHA.
Do you have a chart of account as numbers that we can look at that correlates to those?
Underlying it, yes, in the budget book, it's a more summary presentation, but there'll be a line for I believe there will be a line for MHA as a revenue stream.
There's a chapter for every department. If you go to the budget book online, and there'll be a chapter for every department. And every department, that they have helpfully created sort of a template for how they provide the information, and they show all of the sources of revenue, and how much for each of those revenue sources, as well as what the planned expenditures are for that department. And then they'll give an overview for each department of what the major changes are from the previous year.
Is that by specific accounts, or is
Yeah,
that by program?
You'll, on the revenue side, it is by revenue source, which,
What about the expenditure side?
on the they'll show you programmatic expenditures as well. So there's,
Here's a question I have. You passed the soda tax,
correct.
and it was for a specific purpose. And then we find out the soda tax is not used for that purpose, it's used for another purpose. How does that happen?
So, interesting question. The purposes of the soda tax are, generally speaking, early education and food access. So the soda tax revenues have only ever been spent on early education and food access. What happened as part of the 19 and 20 budget is in an effort to make things balance. What the mayor proposed, and at least initially the council approved, was that some of those monies would be used to pay for things, food access and early education, that had otherwise been funded from that general fund that we've just been talking about. So they met the legal restrictions, right? But it was not new programming. It was to help pay for some of the existing stuff, because that freed up money to go to spend on other things.
Who's that?
So
That's the planning funds.
to be very clear, we were entirely transparent about what we were doing, and we did it at the time out of necessity.
And the council's response at that time was to say, we don't want this to happen again, and we are expecting the creation of a special fund so that it doesn't happen again, and that's what we did. But for MHA, there already is a special fund that's already created. We're not going to have this argument again about MHA fees, where the money goes and then it comes out to spend.
Okay, so there's a fund number that I can look at.
I'm sure there's
MHA likely doesn't have its own fund, but rather it flows into the Office of Housing Fund, but you can
So
see
it gets mixed up.
with other dedicated resources to.
for building housing.
Exactly. So
I think it mingles with the housing levy dollars, but
It does.
only the low-income rental housing development dollars. So for instance, where Office of Housing has issued what's called a request for proposal for nonprofit housing developers to compete for the dollars that we have available for affordable housing. We blend the money from MHA, used to be incentive zoning, and together with the levy dollars, because they're supposed to be used for the exact same purpose. We tell our nonprofit housing providers we have X number of dollars. Write your applications, write your grant applications, compete, we'll pick the best ones, and then in December, the Office of Housing will make an announcement of how many of those projects have been awarded, and they will be funded with both housing levy dollars and MHA dollars, because they're supposed to be used for exactly the same purpose under law.
Okay, what's the total amount of levy money received?
So I haven't had the page open, so the page of the budget that you will want to get to on your own is 238. And there is a full accounting, so it's so great that I have it open. So
I'm sure you keep it open for these next couple of months.
there you go. I'm just paging down. So zoning and subdivision fees, which is probably includes MHA, 18 million, actually forecast of 25 million. The the levy at 37.8 million, actually 37.99 rounding up. There's some significant property sale revenue for the mega block. So we sold a piece of property in South Lake Union. Share of that money is going to the Office of Housing. That's also called out here. So that gives you a sense.
Yeah, but what's the, okay, is that,
And those are each separate accounts.
how much money or taxes are being collected for levies, like Seattle forward?
Well, yeah,
It'll be different for,
Yeah,
it'll be in a different place for every department. So
Yeah.
you asked him about the housing levy, now he's looking at
That's
the
what
housing
we're
levy
doing, so we don't
funds.
have
The transportation
There's a
levy.
summary, there's a revenue summary at the front of the budget, in the introduction section, that highlights that as well. So you can, it's really remarkably transparent. It's also 600 pages long because there's a whole lot of
You
information.
have to know what you're looking for.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to be obnoxious about it, it's just like it's tricky to but it's all there. And there's no, I actually, this is what I do, I appreciate there's someone who cares as much, but I'm going to try to find, other people have questions, I can do this while.
Mainly, I guess what I've been looking for your charter accounts, so that I could see what kind of numbers you had for different programs and be able to track that, what came through the source went into it and how it was expended, because then you'd be able to see, well, another one I have is the taxes levied for more policemen. We've been told the money's been spent, but we have no more FTEs in the police department. So where was that money spent? Because when you promoted to the public, it was said that was for additional police. The money's been spent, no additional police. And I guess, as a person interested in government, I'm interested, how's that happen,
Yeah, no, I know that one well. What I can tell you, if you look at the police budget, it is true that we've been struggling to hire as many officers as we would like. However, our investments in the police department have increased significantly. If for no other reason than the salaries that they are paid have grown significantly, and that so I'm not arguing with you, right? I mean,
But you budgeted for that separately, right?
Exactly, but there was an increase in the B&O tax that was associated with trying to increasing the size of the police force, right? I don't know, actually, I'd have to go back and look to, given where we stand today versus where we were when that tax was approved, right? How many officers we have or don't have. But the other thing that happens, and one of the reasons that the police budget is relatively large, even as we have not had those officers, is that the way the SPD has made up for shortage of officers is to use overtime. And that, for what it's worth, and I'm the budget guy to tell you this, overtime actually doesn't cost us any more than regular time because it's time and a half is what we pay overtime, right? But if you hire a new officer in, if you count training and vacation and all the other things, and they're all well deserved, I'm not going to, it turns out that the net cost is something like the equivalent of time and a half. So on the margin, it's actually not cost ineffective, double negative, to use overtime. So short of officers, and actually in the mayor's proposed budget, there's an $800,000 request to fund emphasis patrols, and that is largely a request for overtime because it's a matter of, that's a $400+ million budget, so those are big numbers, but that doesn't buy you as much as you might think. But just as an example, so in the end, that money has helped expand the police budget.
But to work the police overtime certainly doesn't guarantee a stronger police force in our city. It actually promotes youth.
No, I'm not suggesting that we wanted. We are active. So another thing is, I wasn't intending to make this. So another thing that's in the mayor's budget is there was a task force that was pulled together, actually including council staff and a variety of folks earlier this year to take a look at what was our problem about recruitment and retention. Because we had not only had a problem recruiting officers, we had some issues in retaining new officers as well as older officers. So trying to understand what was driving that. And so there's significant investment in the strategies that came out of that recommendations about how to keep folks on the force and to bring them in. There's also a request to continue a practice that started this year of, paying bonuses for folks who transfer into the department. It's been a bit of a game of escalation because other departments have been doing the same and picking off our guys and our officers, and now we are, it's market, it's supply and demand. So that's another piece that's in there.
And remember reading about the exit interviews with the
Yep.
officers of the
Yep.
paper and some controversy around that.
Yeah, no, we've been learning stuff, so, but those are all pieces there. Yeah,
What happens when you start a budget year and you find out that cost of materials aren't coming in at the same rate, but it's up like 5 or 10%?
so, depending on the situation, right, I mean, so if you're talking about like, building stuff, right, so, typically the department isn't going to, if we're having fully allocated resources, we're not likely to be able to add money, right? Although we do get this, council members described, there's a process by which a couple times a year departments can ask for additional funding. So if we happen to have, if our revenue forecasts were wrong and there's some additional money, it could be that we would consider that. Alternatively, what's going to happen is departments are going to be asked to prioritize. So they have a good deal of management flexibility. The budget does not prescribe a line for this is the amount of money you can spend on asphalt, right? There is an overall paving program. So the department will be then asked to prioritize and decide itself, both within asphalting, if you will, how should we manage this? Should we try to do, I'm going to make this all up, thinner asphalt, or fewer streets, or,
Or don't do the streetcar.
Exactly. Actually, I was about to go there. Alternatively, to say, you know what, asphalting, paving is very important, but this other thing that we otherwise were going to do is less important, and so we're going to shift money over there. And those kinds of operational budgetary decisions are made all the time, and to be clear, the departments have a good deal of flexibility to do that, which really makes sense because they're on the ground every day seeing this stuff, and I'm this deep in that wide, and council members are dealing with 1,000 different issues as well. But we also have a regular reporting process, so we're keeping track of, for instance, we'll have a target for how many lanes are going to get repaved over the course of the year, and we're getting updates quarterly about how they're doing, and if that's the issue, they'll flag it and tell us, hey, there's a price of materials problem that we're having. And then that perhaps will inform. So when we do the that's a great example of when we do the baselining process, right? They'll come back and say, you know what? The amount of money, if we're going to pave as many streets as we did last year, we're actually going to need 10% more money because the price of asphalt has gone up.
Fewer projects sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what prioritization means, deciding not to do things that you plan to do so that you can do other things.
And a lot of that goes through the Move Seattle Oversight Committee?
That's right.
Yes, I mean, within the context of Lucio, yes, and those kinds of making those decisions, both kind of within programs and then potentially cross programs within that as well.
Or the mayor's office and the council as well make those decisions sometimes.
It's difficult for the council to make those decisions within program areas. So I've been, for instance, advocating for repaving streets in District 1 that have been identified as having failed segments. There's a way that SDOT rates the different streets. Failed is the worst. There's also poor and fair and adequate and good. For instance, there are segments of 35th that are rated as poor. There are segments of Roxbury that are rated poor. SDOT, in its prioritization process, realizing that they can't do all the things that they promised to do in the MOVE levy, has decided to prioritize doing the Delridge Rapid Ride Corridor because there is another, they found efficiencies in doing another planned repavement project that was planned to be done later. They were going to do that earlier so that it aligns with the Rapid Ride project, but it means that 35th, which was actually promised to be repaved back in the Bridging the Gap levy, is falling off of this levy cycle for this levy. So that's 2 levies that it's been promised to. And so I've been trying to advocate a reprioritization, but within individual program areas, it's nearly impossible to insist that those priorities be made because there is that discretion and authority given to SDOT to make those sorts of prioritization decisions.
And Lisa, does public comment help that
Yeah.
process?
Yeah, I mean, just like anything else I do on behalf of the district. And I've tried to make that 35th in particular, an issue that people write me a lot of angry letters that then I can share with Director Noble and the STOT director. But the thing that's really challenging is that asphalt doesn't have a constituency, the same way that sidewalks have a constituency. Bicycling has a constituency. Transit has a constituency. But nevertheless, the condition of our streets affects all of those other groups that do have constituencies.
I cycle to work. I've delivered this line actually at the city council before.
I think asphalt should be more sexy.
No. But I always say, nobody appreciates a newly paved road as much as a cyclist.
Yeah.
I drive obviously a car as well. Potholes sucks in your car. On a bicycle, it's downright dangerous.
Right.
And I'm not there every day. So, yeah, I have to agree. And I don't want to, for what it's worth, from the budget office, when we get, information from SDOT, we do, folks, their job is to ask them difficult questions and to better understand the prioritization that they do. But we also, in no small part, defer to the recommendations of the engineers and the specialists who are there. And they are, none of these are all at some level zero-sum trade-offs, right? So I don't, and I'm not, but making noise, if you will, I know about this roundabout project because it's been made a priority. I was comfortable talking about it because it was raised. We had a discussion with the mayor about what's the best approach on this project. I mean, I can tell you, I was in the room when it happened. And it may not be the right, I don't know enough about the solution and whatever, but just to give you an example of that.
I think it's a great segue to another
Yeah.
transportation priority and whether or not it's in the budget.
Right,
Because I haven't had a chance to look.
Yeah, so, thank you, Lisa. So it's no secret that we have this issue with West Marginal Way, and we've asked Lisa to please champion our West Marginal Way Safe Street initiative about trying to get some kind of a crosswalk or even street signs, a slow down, or there's a driveway coming up, or cutting down the trees, or whatever we have to do to make it safer out here for people exiting and coming into the building, and also crossing the street to get to the T-107 Park and Herring's House Park, which is extremely important to us and the people that visit here. So one of my questions is, because we're kind of a little late in the game, even though everybody knows, I've asked this group to support, and I think everybody does, including all of the people that you represent, your communities, about this West Marginal Way. Now, we were in the Safe Streets, what was it called? Safe Streets Street Fund. That didn't get funded, even though we were the highest rated project in West Seattle. So then SDOT sort of pulled it out, said it was going to cost $1.9 million. We've asked Lisa to try to get this thing into the mayor's budget as a line item, either in her own budget or SDOT's budget, or if we can get the council to come together and get some support as a project in the overall amended budget as a, what is it called, the green line or whatever, I don't know. Green sheet. So that's where we are. We don't know, I mean, it sounds like your project took like a million years.
I think
They
they
got
said
letters back to the,
1942.
I was going to say, yeah, they got the letters back to the 40s.
Yeah.
Well, that's not a good story.
So just a little bit more background on this
Yeah.
project. So there have actually been several attempts to get a crosswalk here. I actually remember back when I was working for Councilmember Nick Licata and the Longhouse was first being built, there were advocates arguing that we needed a crosswalk in this location. And for engineering reasons, I can recall at least two different times SDOT came back and said why this isn't a good location to do a crosswalk. And when I found out that the whole peninsula was going to be rallying for this particular neighborhood street fund project, I got really anxious that there's all this energy going in to put an application in for something that I was pretty sure SDOT was going to come back and say no. And I kept asking SDOT to intervene and like get the word out to people before they got the application in. That didn't happen. To their credit, they feel really badly about everything that happened, and they've actually worked with the community to do a redesign of something that they think will work. And so what I'm interested to find out, one is there anything in the budget, in the CIP for this? And if not, there's a chance that part of the process that Director Noble described.
I'm just sending myself a note, so I
thank you.
follow up. That's all I'm doing here.
Part of the process that Director Noble described in the preparation of the budget is that the mayor asks all the departments for what their recommendations are. And the departments deliver to the mayor something called budget issue papers. And they surface the things that they're hearing from the community, our priorities, things that from their perspective are priorities. And so sometimes even if it didn't make it into the budget, there might be a budget issue paper on it, which might give us a lot of really good information that then I can use to build my case with my colleagues on the council to fund, or at least begin to fund, this project. And it might start like it started for me with the Roundabout project, right? The Roundabout project at first started getting 200,000, and then another 300,000, and then putting in that TBD for the 3 million. So it might start small. It may not start with a fully funded project, but if we could break the project down into components, maybe starting with a design element, figure out what that would cost. That's something that I could pursue, and we can get a CIP page for it, which will then indicate that even if we don't have all the funding for it, that the city is committed to doing it over a period of time. Is that?
Yeah, no, I don't know this one. Like I knew the Roundabout one. I think I'd heard, but I don't know details. I do know that there was an EDI application that was approved that's related to driveway. I don't know more than that.
Well, yeah, to knock down this house to make maybe a drive-through.
Yeah, so
yeah,
so
we're not
that funding is in the budget.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so that
That's part of it.
yeah, no, that's why I know about this other issue at all, because I sit on a committee that reviewed got staff recommendations about equitable development initiative and funding from that. And that's one of them. I don't know a whole lot more about it than that, but I just sent myself a note, so I'll follow up and I'll get back to you to find out what I know about
So
that.
I
And I
was
think
just
you
gonna
have some of it right, but I don't know whether there's what SDOT thinks is a path forward.
Absolutely. We'll figure it out.
Good.
And you're meeting with other council members, right?
Signs that say slow down, for Pete's sakes, what does that cost? I mean,
There's a whole, I got hit by a car on my bicycle in the crosswalk, by a car that blew a red light. Like it's,
no, I mean, I know
There's so
someone
many-
died down on this
Yeah, I mean,
road.
what- yeah,
I don't
it's-
come down here much, but
it's so
I
many.
mean, a sign or a speed bump.
It's sort of counterintuitive. One of the things SDOT worries about is setting up situations that look like they're encouraging people to cross in places that are dangerous, because it has exactly the opposite effect of what you want it to have. So I'm not a traffic engineer, but I know the city often ends up in difficult conversations with communities who are like, we really want a crosswalk here, and that's like, that's a blind curve. You don't actually want a crosswalk there. And I'm not saying that's the situation. I'm just like, that's.
So be real careful.
Yeah, you know, I was thinking that as a matter of fact.
Do you guys want to, like, I didn't bring the budget calendar with, you got something?
No, I will send it. I mean,
Okay,
send it.
all right. But just big picture overview, as Director Noble mentioned, we're going to be starting departmental presentations on Friday. And what that means is every department that the council and the executive identify as departments that have significant changes in funding, either new initiatives or a shift in priorities, will come and they'll give a budget overview. We do that over a few days, and then from that, the council central staff, our analysts, will identify what we call budget issues. And so those are based on the departmental presentations, things that we might want to delve into more deeply in building our budget. And so it might be questions about the assumptions that the departments are working under to prioritize its spending. It might mean questions about programs that fit in that department purview that aren't receiving increases that we might want to see increases in, based on analysis of additional needs. And we'll do that for a few days. We'll have a budget public hearing on that we consider to be the public hearing on the mayor's proposed budget. The budget chair of the council, who's Councilmember Bagshaw, will propose her own balancing package, so listening to what council members have said are their interests. She'll make cuts and adds to, again, present a balanced package that reflects council members' interests. We'll have another public hearing on the chair's balancing package, and then we'll have another opportunity to make adjustments to it as council members if we don't feel that the budget chair's proposed budget reflects the needs that individual council members have identified, again with the caveat that for everything that we add, we have to cut something. And so the process that the council goes through in order to do all that is we'll develop, first we'll develop, they used to be called green sheets. We're not calling them green sheets anymore. I'm slipping my mind what we're calling them.
Budget requests.
Council budget requests, yep. And when we first identify our budget requests, we don't need to have any other council members co-sponsoring it. But as we get closer to the final budget package, if the budget chair does not include our ads, that's when we have to generate support from other council members to change her proposed budget. So it would be really helpful to me, and it's one of the reasons why I was a champion for this group to come together, is for you to help identify what the priorities are for the District 1 neighborhoods for me to advance during the budget process. Before this group got together, when you were still thinking about pulling it together, I pointed to the work that Councilmember Juarez had done in getting her district last year to have a really strong voice on what the priorities were for the district, and that's because the community groups all came together and spoke with one voice. That sends a really powerful message to my colleagues on the council and the budget chair when they're having to decide what priorities they have. Sorry, I don't know what you were trying to show me.
It's the budget calendar.
So why don't you just say what day the budget public hearings are?
Yep.
That'd be great.
So October 3rd, which is not this Thursday, but next Thursday, is the public hearing. The first one, as you described it, as a public hearing on the mayor's budget. And then the second public hearing is on October 22nd. And that'll be at the very last day of the budget deliberations and issue ID section.
Those are made public.
Yes, at 5:30 at City Hall. The council will go until everyone is done with their public comment.
For 13 minutes.
Yes.
Yeah, we're often there from 5:30 to 11.
Yeah, I spend time at those meetings. It's only 2 minutes each, but with 200 people, you do the math. And it's, yeah, but it's.
The mayor made a proposal to levy a tax on Lyft and Uber.
Correct.
And she said the revenues that would be directed toward homelessness and issues of housing. What happens, now her budget's being built on that assumption, what happens to that budget if that tax doesn't pass?
So this is a subtlety here, but actually what the budget proposes is to spend very little of that money in this initial year. So the two primary, there's three primary purposes that the revenues would be used for. Affordable housing, which I would make distinct from homelessness, not that they're completely unrelated, but it's to capital investments and the operating costs associated with affordable housing. Transportation, another in particular, the Center City streetcar. And then lastly, to set up a dispute resolution center for the drivers themselves, so that the drivers have a way to advocate for themselves when they get, in particular, the most significant complaint that they have is when they get kicked off the system and aren't allowed to earn a living. So those are the three primary components. We also need some money to actually set up the bureaucrats, and I use that term endearingly because I am one, to monitor and enforce. But in the first year, what we're expecting would come into effect in the beginning of July. Half a year of revenue is approximately $9 million, but we're proposing to spend just over $1 million of it, and it's only the part to set up the regulatory pieces of it so we could get it going. So we're not counting on that money in large part, and we're not going to spend it until we have a sense that it really will come. We don't have a cash flow problem, so if we have confidence that a revenue is coming, even if it wasn't going to come until July, we could spend against it in March. But we had to be confident that it was coming, and we'll see how things evolve. But we may not have that confidence in that tax ultimately.
Yeah,
We will see.
If you anticipate that amount and you do not get the tax, what do? You've already looking at what your needs are out there, and that's why you're asking for the tax. And so now you don't get the tax revenue.
So I can answer the question. Yeah, so
Build less housing?
right. So we would. Right, there are two things that would happen in this particular case. Three things. We would build less affordable housing. We would not have an obvious funding source for the Center City Connector, so we would need to either not proceed with that project or go back to SDOT, if you will, and figure out whether there was other things that we would sacrifice in order to move that project forward. And also we wouldn't be able to do this dispute resolution center. So that's.
That legislation is budget legislation, though?
It is.
So we will know. We are going to be deliberating on that piece of legislation that will create that fund source in the budget. So we'll know by the time we pass the budget
If it's a go or not.
if it's a go or not. That's right. Yeah.
And if it isn't, though, you have to readjust your budget plans.
We'll have to, yes, we'll have.
And again, from a budgeting perspective, it's a very challenging revenue stream. We have because of all the regulations we do, we have a very good idea of how many rides there are. But at the same time, the mayor is submitting legislation that will establish a minimum compensation, a minimum wage essentially for drivers. We expect that will have the effect of raising the cost of trips. I'm an economist by training. That will likely have the effect of reducing the number of trips. So it's been tricky to forecast what those revenues would be, and may yet face legal and electoral challenges as well. So we've been cautious in the budget about committing those monies in this initial year. The other concern for me and my sharing is that those companies are losing a great deal of money, and their long-term successes or viability is an open question as well. That said, I think people have become accustomed to paying to move around the city, and so I think there will be an activity to be taxed along the way, how much it is, and to be clear, you may or may not care for this, and I'm not. I think it is worth considering, if you hadn't thought about it, that these folks are making money on the public right of way. They are where Uber and Lyft are. It turns out they're not getting rich, but they're trying to get rich. Driving around on the roads that you paid to have paved, and they are wearing them out, and that's fine, right? They're providing a service that people are willing to pay for. But the idea that they would contribute some revenue as part of that endeavor seems eminently fair to me. And now I'm editorializing, but that's the perspective of a budget guy.
Okay, any others? Oh.
Yeah, I just have one quick question. In this all funds appropriation, is there a rainy day fund
Yeah, so
in each of these departments or an overall rainy day?
So we have, it varies. It varies by fund, and so the general fund, we have two large or reasonably sized financial reserves. We have a rainy day fund, which is meant to make up for shortfalls in revenues. So we've balanced the budget on a forecast. Like, we start spending the money January 1, 2020, and we're we predicted how much money we're going to get, but we could be wrong. If we hit a recession in the middle of the year, we're not going to have as much money, so we can, with council authority, dip into the rainy day fund to help make that up. It's about $60 million there now, which, I don't know, that may sound like a lot of money. It's a $1.5 billion budget. It's not that much money. So if we dip in, we'll have to be cautious about thinking about how long a time we need to lean on it, right? Because you don't want to use it all up in the first year of what could be a 2 or 3 year recession, as an example. We also have a comparable amount of money, again, supporting the general fund, that we call the emergency sub-fund, and it's to take care of expenditures you don't expect. So if you have a really big snowstorm, and you have to spend lots of time and money plowing the streets, and you didn't expect to, you might need to dip into that. It turns out we don't. We'll have enough money not to dip into the emergency sub-fund to deal with the storm, but we do have the proposed budget includes some reserves. Same time we're sending on the budget, we're sending on a supplemental budget, and we've built some reserves because what we did do is we ran down we had money that's set aside for dealing, I'm now on a storm tangent here, to deal with plowing and snowstorms. And it wasn't quite enough, but departments have managed to live with those expenses. But the season is not over, right? So we've got November and December coming, so we all want to make sure there's...
February.
Yeah, exactly. So, but then, for instance, in the utilities, they have separate reserves as examples, and on the soda tax, so we have a separate fund for the soda tax. The mayor's proposing, so we're redirecting the money away, so the money that we're undoing the supplanting. You understand this language, I can tell. So, and as part of that, we have some one-time the unspent resources from 2019. What happened is we budgeted to spend $21 million of soda tax. We're now expecting to take in $24 million. So there's about $3 million there that we didn't expect. There's some other from the previous year. And we're recommending as part of the budget to put $2 million of that into a reserve because we're going to manage this account by itself. And we want to know, in a recession, maybe people buy less soda. Or more specifically, if the tax ultimately has the effect of reducing the amount of soda consumption, a reserve will give us some time to adjust our spending patterns to that reality. So we do try to build up those sorts of reserves.
So when the mayor announced that she got this $25 million in real estate taxes, that's basically going to go to the housing department, right? It won't affect this budget. This
Right. It's not. I'm not sure what you're looking at. So, but one of the things the state legislature did. Backing up, the city's taxing authority is largely defined by the state. We can't just tax anything because we want to. And for instance, so there's a tax on real estate transactions. If you sell a house or a piece of property, there's 0.5%. It's actually 1/4% taxes added together, 0.5, so 0.5%. It's a tax it's real estate excise tax. And the city gets that money. It can only be used, however, for certain purposes. Again, the state has restricted it. We can only use it for certain things. They changed the rules in a good way this past session and said that we could use one of those two taxes, REIT 2, for affordable housing. Yes. And what the mayor is proposing is to use $5 million a year for the next 5 years. Again, because we're not worried about cash flow, we're actually trying to potentially spend that money now, knowing that the revenues are going to come, and also knowing that the dollars won't go out the door right away necessarily for a housing project because it'll take a little while. But it adds $25 million to our overall effort on affordable housing. The budget is designed to take a balance there between putting some of that money into affordable housing, then also not spending it all there because that real estate excise tax money is used for major maintenance activities in the city. It actually pays for things like paving and bridge painting and installing new roofs on community centers and new heaters in swimming pools and things that are, kind of not very exciting, but aren't important at the same time. So we wanted to put some money into housing, but we didn't want to sacrifice that kind of below visual but really important investments in major maintenance.
And one of the reasons why this is good news is that many people, including, you've probably heard me reference the McKinsey report, have been arguing that we need to double our investments in permanent supportive housing, not just in Seattle, but in the region. And about 3 months ago, the Office of Housing was anticipating that they'd only have about $50 million to go out this year. Again, like I mentioned before, we have a notice of funding availability that goes out every year from the Office of Housing, where we allow builders to compete with their projects for affordable housing. And Office of Housing was anticipating that we'd only have about 50 million this year. And in the previous couple years, we've had more, like around 90 million. But with the mayor prioritizing the use of REIT and other revenue sources for housing, the Mercer Mega Block, we're going to be able to get another probably about 90 million out the door this December. And hopefully we'll be able to do it every year for the remaining years of the levy. But it means being
It's a challenge
creative every year, yeah.
What's the advantages of declaring an emergency? Like creating homelessness as an
The
emergency?
state of
We've had
emergency.
We've had different declarations of emergencies.
Yeah,
What's the benefits of that?
it's more a call to arms than it is a
Is there
legal or
any
technical
movement you
piece.
can do in the way of funds once you have that emergency declaration of emergency out there?
Not inherently, no. I mean, it's a separate vote to tap the emergency sub-fund, but I mean, you could use it as an argument to do that. I have argued against using emergency sub-fund to address the homelessness emergency because the homelessness emergency isn't the kind of emergency that we had anticipated, right? It's an ongoing one, so it doesn't really, it's not the right solution to the problem, right? But